Hello, everyone. I'm Dave Taylor from LincolnConspirators.com, and I'm so pleased to be doing a sit-down interview with my guest today, Professor Scott Ellsworth. How are you, Scott?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I have to admit, though, that I'm also terrified to be on the show because LincolnConspirators.com is the premier marketplace for ideas. It is the most important thing out there having to do with the Lincoln assassination. So the stakes are high, but I'm really thrilled to be here.
Well, you know how to flatter your host, sir, so that bodes
It's
well
true.
for someone doing a book talk. Well, as a thank you, I thank you for that. As a matter of introduction, Dr. Ellsworth is a professor of Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan. He is the author of several best-selling books, including the groundbreaking The Tulsa Race Massacre and an American City's Search for Justice. The Secret Game, a wartime story of courage, change, and basketball's lost triumph. And also The World Beneath Their Feet, Mountaineering, Madness, and the Deadly Race to Summit the Himalayas. Dr. Ellsworth's newest book is entitled Midnight on the Potomac, The Last Year of the Civil War, the Lincoln Assassination, and the Rebirth of America. And it's this book that we're going to chat with him about today. So my first question to you, Scott, is uh, based on you have a variety of interests, as I saw from the names of your other books. So, what drew you to want to write about the end of the Civil War?
So it kind of came through an odd sort of roundabout route. I would say that one of the most important things. So I'm 71 years old. So I can remember as a teenager, sort of the end of the 1960s, the beginning of the 70s, and how divided we were as a nation then. But in my lifetime, we've never been as divided as we are now. Nothing comes close. And the only other time really in our history that we've been as divided. I guess you could say the American Revolution too, but was really during the Civil War. So I was drawn to that era to write a history book that would also have some relevance for the issues that we're facing as our country today. And I talk about this in the acknowledgments for the book, but I've been a fan of the Civil War since I was a little kid. When the centennial of the war is starting to happen, I'm 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 years old. I'm collecting the stamps. I'm paying attention. We take a big family trip, sort of a half vacation, half work trip for my dad from our home in Tulsa, Oklahoma to the East Coast. I have this marvelous book called The Golden Book of the Civil War, which I think my mom had bought for me, and which was a children's version, young person's version of the American heritage history of the Civil War. And I was just entranced by the book. And even though I couldn't, understand a lot of it, the maps of the battlefield, so I convinced my folks that we went to Antietam and Gettysburg. Toward those, I went to certainly the Lincoln Memorial and Ford's Theater. So early on, and I kept that up during my life. Even though I teach at the University of Michigan, most of my career, I've not been a college professor, and I've never written for scholars anyway. I've always written for regular folks. But I worked for 10 years at the Smithsonian. I would pass by Civil War artifacts all day long, every day going to work. So things like that had kept with me. But then the actual route was a very odd one, which was my literary agent said, "What about writing a true crime book?" And I thought,
Hmm.
well, that's an interesting idea. Here's the fact of the matter: true crime books sell like nobody's business.
They do.
They are just gigantic. It's women who buy them, women from their 20s to about their 40s.
My wife is always reading a new true crime book,
Oh,
so
and watching
absolutely.
all of the
We're
podcasts and
always
all of the
watching the documentaries and the Netflix series about
it,
every murder that exists.
exactly. And I knew Truman Capote's In Cold Blood backward and forward and read Norman Mailer's The Executioner's Song. And I knew that there was some, I wanted, if I'm going to write one, I wanted to have some sort of a positive plus message. But then I sat down and I read 17 true crime books in a row,
Wow,
including a lot of bestsellers. And overall, they're just ghastly. I mean,
they're
the books are
sad.
horribly written. They're about horrible people doing horrible things. And I just thought, oh my God, do I really want to do into this? And I tracked down a couple of stories that I thought had potential. they got close, but I just couldn't, bring them home. And then I was just sort of thinking, well, what was the crime of the 20th century? And in the United States, and you might say the Manson murders or JFK. And I thought, well, what was the crime of the 19th century? And to me, there was no doubt it was the murder of Abraham Lincoln. So I started looking into that, and then I stumbled. This is a long answer.
That's
I'm
okay.
nearly done, but I stumbled onto this incredible book, John Wilkes Booth, Day by Day, written
Yes.
by Arthur F. Lew.
Yeah.
And Mr. Lew is deceased, but he was spent his lifetime as working for an insurance company in Pennsylvania, I believe. But on weekends and evenings and family vacations, he was, obsessed with reconstructing the life of John Wilkes Booth. And in the pre-ancestry.com, newspapers.com era, I mean, he must have lived at the National Archives
Yeah.
and found, just every, possible newspaper or documentary mention of Booth. And as I'm reading this book, I'm realizing that the portrait of Booth is not at all the one that I had been taught, incidentally, at Robert E. Lee Elementary School in Tulsa, but that everyone else had been taught too. I mean, that basically that Booth was this second-rate actor living jealously in the shadow of his far more famous father and brother, that he's sort of this lone wolf figure that's volatile and is kind of an archetype for a John Hinckley or a Sarah Jane Moore or a Lee Harvey Oswald. And in reading Lou's book, I realized that's not it at all.
Yeah.
And that we've gotten him wrong. And once that breakthrough happened, I said, well, there might be something here. And then it took really about almost 2 years to figure this out and to figure out, well, what's the story here? And then as I dug, deeper into things, I will shut up at some point, Dave. But
That's okay.
like many people, we assume that after the high tide of at Gettysburg of the Confederacy at Pickett's Charge, that the rest of the war, it was, there's no question that the South is going to lose.
Inevitable. Yeah.
That's inevitable, and everything else is a mopping up. But the more I dug into the last year of the war, I realized, man, that wasn't the case at all. And then it was just my agent was sort of horrified at this at first, like, what is this mess? And I worked very, very hard on sort of outlining the thing, finding what the threads were, but also not telling every story. There's just too much.
Yeah.
So so that took a while, and then writing it was relatively quick. It's like I told my editor the other day that writing a nonfiction book is like making a Chinese meal at home, and that there's a lot of prep work, a lot of cutting, a lot of chopping, a lot of everything ready, but the actual cooking is relatively quick.
Just throw it all together.
Okay,
Once you
so
have all the
sorry, that's
ingredients.
very, all my answers won't be this long.
No, that's okay. I mean, you've covered some of my other questions, so no.
Oh well, sorry.
No, that's okay. And yeah, it is interesting the story of how it started. You were like, this is going to be almost a solo book about the Lincoln assassination, and it became so much more, which it is to the betterment of the book that I think that the way that you give the context, like you said, you can't address every single thing, but part of my favorite part of this book is that I mean, I know about the Lincoln assassination, so a lot of the stuff in here
Yeah, no
covers
kidding.
that. I know some, but all this stuff about like the end of the Civil War, I found fascinating and the context that gives to the crime itself. Because I'm not a Civil War historian. I have a very niche interest and a niche
Right.
focus. And so, I loved everything about the battles leading up to the end of the war, how you really broke them down and how concise they are. And so, I mean, you've kind of partly answered this, but obviously you started with this was going to be a Lincoln assassination book. You then found all the threads that kind of give the context to it. What was your familiarity with Civil War battles before writing this book, and what was your big takeaways from the parts, your chapters about, like, oh, I found your chapter about Jubal Early being so close to taking Washington and then just balking at the last second. Like
Yeah.
he could have ended the war for the Confederacy right then, but he hesitated, and just there was so much drama in reading that, even though I know it happened 150 years ago, but it was like it's just I'm amazed. And so I'm just, you talked about visiting some of these Civil War battlefields, but when it came to the writing part, did you go and take battlefield tours in some of these places,
Yeah,
or?
so I've been to all of the major Civil War battlefields and had been for years. And then back in the 1980s, when I was working at the American History Museum, the Smithsonian, Washington, I reconnected with a childhood friend from Tulsa who had created this is during the home video boom and Blockbuster Video and all that. And he was starting to create um, documentaries for the home video market. And we ended up working together, and I wrote and helped to produce, I think, 4 or 5 videos on the Civil War. We
Nice.
also got James McPherson to help out as well too. So I'd filmed at a lot of those places. I knew them well. When I lived in DC, I used to take friends on bike tours of Gettysburg and things like that. So that was familiar. But I guess part of what went on as well too, the Civil War, the Civil War, amongst other things, this is to this day, this is the still the most important single event in American history. Okay, this is when, even more than the revolution, like who are we,
Yeah.
what do we believe in, and who can fully take part in the world's greatest experiment in democracy? These questions are in high relief. This is also the bloodiest war in our history. I was raised by the World War II generation. My dad was a veteran, all my uncles were. I had an aunt who was a wave. My mom worked for the army, all of my neighbors, all of that,
Oh,
you
and you
know,
you dedicate the book to your parents,
to
I
my
believe. Yes.
parents.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and their
absolutely.
service. Yeah.
And one out of every 300 Americans was killed in World War II. For the Vietnam War, it was one out of every like 3,500. For the Civil War, it's one out of every 50 Americans
Yeah.
die. I mean, every family was affected by this. During the Civil War, one out of every 7 Americans, out of every 7, goes from being enslaved to being free. So it's this such an important event, but it was also the first modern war. I mean, the war begins as this sort of Napoleonic campaign at Bull Run with neat lines of infantry, and it ends 4 years later in the mud and the trenches of Petersburg, like World War One. But it was the first modern war in that the entire society on both sides is becomes mobilized and a part of this. And women are hugely important in this, and so are African Americans. But as we all know, and this is not a knock at all, but 80% at least of all Civil War books are military history, and there's
Yeah.
nothing wrong with military history. It's great, and they're about generals and battles and regiments. And then there's a chunk of books about Lincoln and the politics of the era, and then a much narrow strip of books about African Americans during the war, and frankly, an even narrower strip about women during the war. And what I wanted to do is to put all of these things together. And because you can only explain what happens if everybody is there in the book, or as many people as you can get to. So that was something I wanted to do. But as a result of that, because I didn't want to write a 600-page book, and because I very much want to reach just regular everyday readers who might know a little about the war, but not that much, as well as people who are passionate about it, there's a lot of stuff I had to cut out.
Hmm.
So what you try to um, every page is precious. You want to keep the reader interested and engaged and turning the pages, and you don't have a lot of time to do things. And there's going to be some stuff like Reconstruction policy I punt,
Yeah.
and once
You have
Lincoln
to.
is dead, I don't really follow up very much on what happens. I do on his funeral, of course,
Yes.
but I don't talk a lot about Booth and the other conspirators.
Yeah, and we'll come back. I'm going to ask you about that, but I
Sure.
did notice that. But yeah, I do have to say the way in which you've written this book. I mean, I read a lot of history, and it is a very rare and special thing when an author can produce something that flows and is easy to digest. And Midnight on the Potomac is one of those rare books. It's the history of the last year Civil War, but it's incredibly captivating and tells you the history without bogging the reader down with too many details that while I love those details, I know from my own writing, after I read it, I'm like, that is a messy, long sentence because I really wanted to tell him this one thing. And you have this magical conciseness in the way that you have written. And it makes it so the book is really enthralling from start to finish. This is one of the few books that I've received, and I'm like, all right, let me just read it, and I just couldn't stop reading it. As a, the fiction books, when I read that, I have that sense, but rarely in history am I like, I need to know, I got to keep going. And this is just so well written that it has that narrative fiction like thriller, like I want to keep seeing what's going to happen
Well,
next.
Dave, that means the world to me. I mean, it really does, and especially, and also to your listeners too. Like, who is this guy who comes out of nowhere, and is going to play in our league? We'll wait and see what happens. So that really means a lot. I think I do think too as well. Part of what was behind the book and how it was created is again, we're in a very difficult moment in our country right now. We're also in a very cynical age. I mean, I've taught at the University of Michigan now for the last 18 years or so. So I teach in an undergraduate department. I meet lots of young people. I'm also the father of 23-year-old twins. So I have a sense of what's going on. And not only do young people need to have a better understanding about how the American political system works, but we also need a better understanding and appreciation for all of these heroes that we have in our history that have sacrificed so much over the decades to give us this country that we live in. And I've wanted to do that and to remind people, don't despair. We've got there are lots of heroes there. And I guess the other aspect of this, um, Dave, is that so I went to graduate school at Duke in the 1970s, and that was really at the time when college historians writing narrative history was really sinking away,
Mm.
and instead everything is theory. And what, as a result of that, history enrollments have declined, stuff like that. But those books aren't read very well. So most of our best historians actually are journalists. But I wanted to bring the tools of it, and they do a very good job. I'm not knocking that, but
Absolutely.
bringing the historical tools that I had been taught how to use with research and whatnot, and bring them, but to try to write something that could have more of a general appeal.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned before, your book also does a great job of bringing a variety of voices and representation and perspectives back into the story that has for too long, like you said, it's been military history. It's about the great men. It's been about the generals, about the presidents, and that you have, like you said, you have chapters where you're telling the story through the perspective of women who were there, or African Americans, both
Right.
freed and enslaved. And the picture, even when you are talking about the great men, even of course we're talking about Abraham Lincoln,
Sure.
but when you talk about him, like when he is like touring Petersburg or Richmond, and just the flocking to him, like I got the way in which you've written it and bringing those, visualizing it, it got emotional. Like were able to elicit an emotion for something that for a lot of history things, it's like it's the past. It's it doesn't always come across, especially you feel disconnected sometimes as for the subject matter. But even the way that you've written that, and just the outpouring and the contrabands, as they were so called, when they are traveling with Sherman and just abandoning their homes and not knowing if this is going to be an actual escape for them, or if they're throwing everything away, and just the young and the old just traveling with Sherman, even though Sherman wasn't a fan of them, just hearing their story and seeing it through the way you've put it through is just incredibly moving. And like you said, those are heroes that you don't learn about most of the time in the great men, history. And so I guess you've already answered it, but why did you feel it was important to include these voices and these perspectives in this story?
Well, and I'll also go back and talk about Lincoln just a little bit too, and what I tried to do there. I mean, in the end, and this is not to take any, if we don't have, if the loyal Americans don't have Lincoln, Sherman, and Grant, I don't know how the war ends. I mean,
Yeah.
frankly, those men were all geniuses in different ways. I mean, Lincoln is just sort of beyond everyone in so many regards. Um, but I also, why loyal Americans end up winning the war. And let me just say this. The South was never going, the stars and bars were never going to fly over Central Park or Boston Common, anything like that. The question was whether the Confederacy was going to be able to survive as an independent nation, or whether the states that seceded were able to rejoin the Union, but slavery would be would allowed to thrive. That's the issue, and that was not preordained at any
Right.
point. I mean, that's up in the air in 1864. Okay. So, but what in the end, why the loyal citizens win the war, along with again the great men, and that's very important. It's really this remarkable coalition of of everyday Americans, some in uniform, some not, men and women, blacks and whites, free and unfree, native born and immigrant, who join together, work together, and despite having different priorities, and they defeat the Confederacy, they destroy slavery, they preserve the Union, and they give us a chance to do a better job of living up to our founding principles as a nation. And it's because of them that everyone listening to this program was able to grow up in this country. We all stand on their shoulders. So I did want to give them credit. Now, let me just zip back just a second with Lincoln, which is, what do you do with Lincoln? I mean,
Yeah.
Lincoln is this gigantic figure, and rightfully so. And we all know that with malice toward none, the incredible statue in the Lincoln Memorial and whatnot. And while I was thinking about how do I deal with him, um, I was reminded of the great American film director John Ford. So, in about 1938 or so, John Ford decides he wants to make a movie about Lincoln, and called Young Mr. Lincoln. If you've not watched it, get it. There's a wonderful Criterion Collection DVD of it, Blu-ray as well too. It's got all these extras, but
That has Fonda as Lincoln, correct?
it's yeah, and so he goes to young
Yep.
Henry Fonda, who's just getting his career going, and asks if he'll play Lincoln. And Fonda says, "No, I couldn't play him. He's the great man." Blah blah blah. And John Ford is, "You idiot! I'm not talking about that guy. I'm talking about the dumb lawyer in
Yeah.
Illinois." And Fonda was like, "Oh, okay, all right, that." But getting that into my mind, the book opens with Tad.
Yeah.
Tad Lincoln, the youngest surviving son of Abraham and Mary. And what I wanted to do was to humanize Lincoln, because as a nation, while we lost this president, a family also lost their father and their husband. I wanted to talk about his physical maladies and sort of bring him back to a human level as well too. So that's what I tried to do, and that was a lot more fun and more interesting, frankly, than writing about Reconstruction policy or something like that. And because I didn't have to do that in the book.
Yeah, and I think you do a wonderful job of bringing the humanity of Lincoln, absolutely, because he has been, ever since his assassination, he's become an American saint. And I believe there's
Yeah.
the program at the Lincoln Museum in Springfield. They have a little movie, and it's like we haven't been able to see him clear ever since. Like ever since he was
Yeah.
killed, like our perspective of him has always been off, and not that it's wrong, but that he's always been, larger than life. And you bring him back. And it's not degrading Lincoln to point out his humanity, just
No,
like there
not
are
at all.
books that would criticize Lincoln for things that he did that deserve criticism or views that he had. But you do a good job of bringing the humanity of Lincoln, and also, as you kind of talked about at the beginning, you bring a different view of John Wilkes Booth, which could be more dangerous to say you
Right.
humanize him, but I mean that. You have the great chapter which is just called Booth, and as you said, Art Luke's book is a testament to it. And I knew Art. He was a dear friend. He shared a bunch of stuff with me, and so
Oh
when I
wow,
saw
I'm
him,
impressed that you got to know him. He must have
uh
been a remarkable man.
he was so generous that he actually sent me like his files in like a USB drive. And still
Oh,
to this
nice.
day, I will be doing research on stuff that he accumulated in the 70s and 80s and then scanned and like sent it. So yeah, Art was a dear friend. And so when I saw how well you wrote of him in your references and stuff like that, I was like, all right, this is going to be a good book because you picked a strong historian to follow in the footsteps of.
And
But
let me just interject just very quick on this. Hold your question, but
yeah,
it's been and this is not a knock on professional historians at all, but thank goodness that the Civil War has not been the sole property of academic historians.
Mm.
And there are wonderful ones, Gary Gallagher,
Oh yeah.
James McPherson, Benjamin Quarles, you go on and on and on and on. But there have been these dedicated amateurs who do just excellent work. I mean, James Hall,
Mm.
others that we can think of, and they've really, and it's their work that my work is certainly building upon. It's just that a lot of their work never got into the mainstream, and a lot of people never heard of their discoveries. So, I mean, I did a lot of research for this book. I'm lucky in
Absolutely.
that the second largest university library in America I could hit with a baseball in the
Yeah.
office building it. And if they don't have it, they'll get it for you. But I mean, all of these regimental histories, all this stuff, it was all available to me. But it's really these amateurs again, and that is not in a pejorative sense at all, non-professional historians who have done such key work on helping us to better understand the Civil War.
Absolutely. And I will say that's particularly true in the subset of Lincoln Assassination
Absolutely.
because the Lincoln historians, I mean, it's the sad part, I understand, and they're writing their entire biographies on Lincoln. They only have so much space to talk about his
Yeah.
assassin and what's there to say. And so what often happens is that they, get a little lazy, or it's just as the prior views of him have been as this second-rate actor, just, such a diehard Confederate, and that he's jealous about his brother or things like that.
Right.
And he was always a bad actor, so it makes sense that he would do this. But as
Right.
you rightfully point out, that this is not the correct picture of John Wilkes Booth, which I appreciate because so much in the discourse is to make him seem and I understand it. Like there is a reason culturally and
Yeah.
just societally why we need to distance ourselves from a man who killed the president. We,
Right.
of course, are supposed to hate and vilify him, and for good reason.
Right.
But there is also a human story there, and there was a reason and a livelihood that led up to that. And so, why do you think? I mean, and you've done a great job of dispelling, I think, some of the myths around Booth, but why do you think the discourse around John Wilkes Booth seems to negate his fame, his success, and his general like affability and friendship? Why do you think that happened, and why is it that you decided to counter that?
Well, I decided to counter it just by the weight of the evidence, and
Yeah.
that you just had. I mean, somebody interviewing me or at a recent book talk said that wanted to compliment me on rehabilitating the reputation of John Wilkes Booth as an actor, at least. And I was
Oh,
like,
okay.
okay. But the other thing is that John Wilkes Booth was not irrational. He was a
Right.
rational man. I mean, we have to, obviously foreground the fact that he's a racist, he's a white
Hmm.
supremacist, he's dedicated to serving the Confederacy in every way that he can. But what happens, and I write a little bit about this in the book, is that, as you well know, in the first decades of the 20th century, we have this movement, the Lost Cause.
Yeah.
And this is promoted by Southern white politicians and businessmen with help from Northern politicians and businessmen that we're going to now rehabilitate the Confederates. So, amongst the loyal states in the North in the 19th century, Lee and Stonewall Jackson, these people were traitors. They should have been
Yeah.
hung.
Yeah.
And now we're going to get this makeover, and now they're going to become American heroes. Now the Civil War is not about slavery, which it was, and instead becomes a
States' rights.
squabble between well-meaning white men about states' rights and all of this kind of stuff. All of a sudden, now we have a statue of Jefferson Davis in the United States Capitol. The U.S. Mint puts out a commemorative coin
Oh, and during the 60s, you're seeing the faces of the traitors everywhere during the
everywhere. And then in
centennial.
the
Yeah.
20s, it booms again. Of course,
Yeah.
this is the time of D.W. Griffith and,
Yep.
Birth of a Nation. And the Klan uses that as a recruitment device. So, and then even Lincoln, there were plenty of people in the South who were thrilled when they learned that Lincoln had been killed.
Yeah.
They'd hated him, they'd want him dead for a long time. But that sort of gets changed now that, well, Lincoln was really not going to be very hard on us. He's who we wanted in and all this. But you can't rehabilitate somebody going up behind a person watching a light comedy in a theater, putting a derringer to the back of their head and blowing their brains out.
Yeah.
There's just no
He's a
way
coward. He's a
to
coward.
you can't do anything with that. So what happens is that Booth's murder of Lincoln becomes completely divorced from any connections to Confederate war aims whatsoever. And in fact, even more than that, it's portrayed that the wars is over at Appomattox.
Yeah.
And while practically it may have been, in reality it was not.
Yeah.
Jefferson Davis, moves to Charlotte. There, he wants to keep up the war. You still have 100,000 armed Confederate soldiers in the field. It's months until the final surrenders happen. And so this becomes this, act of a madman. There was uh, D.W. Griffith, who made, of course, Birth of a Nation, as many of your viewers know, is the most controversial
Yeah.
film ever in American history, and
Absolutely.
certainly the most racist as well, too. But at the end of his career, Griffith could never get, he made 500 films. He was incredibly innovative, changed movie making. But at the end of his career in the 30s, he's alcoholic, he's bitter, he can't get the big stars, but he makes his first talkie, and it's actually called Abraham Lincoln.
I
And
love this part. You have this in the end of your book where you're
yeah,
talking.
where Abraham Lincoln is, where the actor playing Lincoln kind of sleepwalks with things and looking off and says, "This will be my greatest role." And so you just turn Booth into this automaton rather than somebody who had a specific political wartime goal and was quite rational in how he went about and did it. It's just that I don't believe that he's acting alone in this.
Yeah. Well, and so we'll talk about that. Your book shines a light into the murky world of the Confederate underground, of spies and agents, and you document various plots undertaken by by Confederate sympathizers in advance of Confederate, needs. Now, what was this aspect of the Civil War something that you had intended to explore when you first started thinking about this subject? And aside from the assassination of Lincoln, what was the most surprising aspect of Confederate espionage that you explored?
So I guess there would be a couple things. No, I hadn't really planned on looking into this, but as the deeper I got into this, and again, this is done, you know, I'm standing on the shoulders of others. You of course are well, and many of your readers are well familiar with, Tidwell, Hall, and Gaddy's Come Retribution,
Yeah,
and which has got a lot of great material in it. It's also one of the densest and most
it is.
difficult books to read.
It is the
It,
absolute opposite of your book.
it's repetitive, it's
Yeah,
horrible, it is a pain to read.
yeah,
And as a result of that, hardly anybody knows about it,
yeah,
and the same way that certainly Edwards and
yeah.
Steers's, the Lincoln assassination. I mean, these are just gold mines, and I panned for gold in them, but the more I looked into it, so I think there were a couple things. One thing was how surprising it was uh, the number of people who were clearly trying to kill Lincoln, whether they were connected to the Confederate High Command or Confederate government or not. That we had these different attempts on his life. I mean, that was shocking to me. Certainly. And then I just lost the thread of what was the original question,
Oh, but
David?
just if there was another, because you cover
Oh, I know
lots
what
of
you mean.
different plots.
So
Yeah.
the other thing that I knew about the Confederate attempt to burn down New York City,
Hmm.
but what became clear to me was after the disasters for both sides at the Wilderness and Spotsylvania, where you have more than 60,000 soldiers, casualties, whatever it is total. The Confederates knew, of course, that at this point they can't win the war on the battlefield. Their early success. And I praise the Confederate common soldier. They were just absolutely remarkable. And it's only at the end of the war that the Union soldiers are on their level. And they are due praise as soldiers. And I was happy to give that to them. Um, but it's clear that they can't maneuver, they can't do this stuff. They're stuck in these siege positions. But the Confederates are desperate to win. There is no lack of will to fight.
Yeah.
And so they launched this terror war, against the civilian population of the North in the late summer and the fall of 1864. And, there are a number of things that they do, a lot of things that they try. It's most of it comes out of Canada, out of Confederate Secret Service agents and others in Montreal and Toronto. And I think that that shocked me about how large of an effort it was. They had $500,000, a lot of money
Yeah.
to spend, and they were very creative. And in fact, if necessity is the mother of invention, the Confederates get a lot of credit for not having much to work with, but figuring out things. They were ahead, as horrible as it is, in landmines, which are of course known as torpedoes. Near the end of the war, there was a uh, a scientist who had been a chemist who had been a professor at Princeton and Columbia, but he was from Maryland. The war breaks out. He ends up going south. He's inventing poison gas at the end. So they're trying lots of different things. So that was surprising to me. But I realized you have to put all this together, all these threads. There's no, like in the book, I want to make this very clear. There's no smoking gun that says definitely Booth was working at the behest of the Confederate Secret Service in doing that. But there's a lot of evidence that points toward that conclusion, and I allow the reader to make up their own mind with that.
Yeah, I will say the book definitely, I think you're right that, and I personally, of course, and we discussed this a little bit in emails before we
Right.
did this, that I'm less convinced of the Confederates' connection to Booth, but I will admit the smoke is there. The gun may not be there, but there is smoke there. There's something, there is all these connections, and that you can't just explain them away and dismiss them. It's there. It's in the air, and what does that mean is up to, like you said, up to different readers.
Well,
Yeah.
and to me, I mean, there's of course, that after after the Parker House meeting, whether that was actually intelligence gathering or not, all of a sudden, Booth goes down to Baltimore and he sees Sam Arnold and O'Laughlin, and now he's an expert on kidnapping and an
Mhm.
expert on how you can move a body across the Potomac River, and that he's got all these supplies. And he just doesn't think that stuff, at least to my mind. Somebody else is giving him that idea. Just the number of Confederate agents, spies, fellow travelers that he consistently runs into. And Lewis Powell is important in that. And I think Betty Owensby just did such a great job with her
Mhm.
book. But before it had been, well, Booth was older. He's really telling the younger Powell what to do. Powell was a seasoned vet. He was a killer. He was definitely an agent, and really the final piece that really got to me again was Clara Morris's book. Now, Clara Morris, as some of your listeners may know, was an actor. She had a very long career. She was born in the 1840s. She didn't die until 1925, but she was friends with Booth. She worked with him, and her portrait of Booth in Life on the Stage, her 1901 memoir, is just filled with all of this really believable detail
Yeah.
and
She's
incredible
got great
detail
stories about him.
and stories and all that. And then, she writes this, these couple of sentences at the end. I'll read them for you. Undoubtedly, he, Booth, conspired to kidnap the president. That would appeal to him. But after that, I truly believe he was a tool. Certainly, he was no leader. Those who led him knew his courage, his belief in fate, his loyalty to his friends, and because they knew these things, he drew the lot as it was meant he should from the first. I found her portrait of Booth, as short as it is, to be the most convincing as to, in bringing out his character. So that conclusion meant a great deal to me.
Yeah, and I love the stories that Claire Morris that she kind of portrays because she definitely had an eye on him. And but I will say my one issue is even though to me what you read is clear, but it's also it's her opinion. And
Sure.
my one issue is that Claire Morris knew Booth for only 2 weeks. She was a stock actress in Cleveland when he came and did like, or maybe it was 3 weeks when he did his tour there.
Right.
And so that's the entirety. And so I believe her story is about seeing him in Cleveland and patting the little boy on the
Right.
head after he
Right.
knocks him
Right.
down. But I question, I would put more emphasis myself if they had been closer actors.
No,
Like if it
no,
was
and
a name of
I
someone who'd
get
been
that.
around the
I
time.
get
Yeah,
that. It's just that it just was so searing. Poets and others can have these insights where they can meet
absolutely.
somebody at a party and they can just read them in 5 minutes. And let me just say this that I don't. and also, some of these, Hall and some of these other people are kind of lining up in this camp as well too. But I've spent 50 years writing about the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, and I've fought for 50 years against conspiracy theories on
Oh
this.
yeah.
I don't believe in conspiracy theories in general, but this was something that it just rang true to me as a historian. But I do leave the question open to others, and if anything, I hopefully Midnight will in your world, in the world, the very important world of your listeners, will help to churn some discussion and get people to think about these
Oh,
things.
absolutely. And that's why I think there's incredible value. I may disagree with the conclusions, but you are bringing these, which to me, this is not a conspiracy theory. Granted,
Right,
there is a conspiracy and it is a theory, but it's not the tinfoil hat
right,
kind
right,
that we normally think of. It
right.
is it's a strong theory to explain, the circumstances, as you point out. There are all these connections that Booth legitimately has to Confederate agents, and you can't, just dismiss them completely. And so, you have different historians who, explain certain things certain
Sure,
ways. And so that's why I do think there's value. It even brings up and challenges. You need someone to come and challenge the assumptions you may have made years ago. And so as I read this, I got halfway through and then I read the chapter about the Parker House and I was like, it's been years since I've actually really looked into it. So I wrote my own little blog post.
yeah, I saw that
And,
later
and
on.
that
We're
wasn't
gonna end it.
directed
Yeah,
at you, but it's
right, right,
because I
right,
had been like, I'd read that before, and I'd just always been like, okay, yeah, maybe he met with Confederate people, and like, what is kind of the evidence behind it, and just doing what I do, which like, let me just
sure,
dig and be like, all right, I don't know if it's as clear. It's still a possibility that Booth was meeting with Confederate agents in
right,
Boston. But I also know he was there for a booty call as well. So that doesn't mean both things couldn't
right,
be true.
right.
But I do like
And
having those
and
conclusions
you
challenged.
know this well, but I mean that's how we keep history alive too, is
Yes.
having debates about these things and talking about them and having passion for them. And some questions we're going to answer and
Yeah.
some we're not,
Exactly.
or we'll just have to wait and see. And different eras, you know, history books reflect the era that they're written in and what
Yeah.
people are interested in, and but it's not only is it keeping it alive, but it's also giving ports of entry so regular citizens cannot get bogged down in some academic
Yeah.
book about something that's going to put them to sleep, and instead have stories that'll make them want to search. They'll eventually get
Yes.
to that level of the detail, the academic detail, but you don't begin that way.
Correct. And you've done a great job of leading people in, and those who are interested, I'm like, oh, I actually want to learn more about it.
Well, and you
You
do
pointed
too.
to
I
the
mean,
things.
your
I mean, it's
side is
all public history.
unmatched,
It's what as I like doing, and you like your books are, and as much public history as like going out and giving a tour and things like that. Um, so your book, I know at one point you write in terms of like the kidnapping plot, the initial
Right.
abduction plot. You write the plan itself was surely not Booth's idea, but had been presented to him either in Boston or Montreal by representatives of the Confederacy, and you provide the evidence, of why
Right.
you think this is the case. I have a question. I feel like you are less definitive, and maybe that's not even the right
Yeah.
word, when it comes to the actual murder. Now, this is likely because the evidence there is little, there's less, we definitely have all these connections with Booth and the Confederates during this abduction
Right.
period, but there is less after the surrender of Lee in the fall of Richmond. So I would just wanted to ask you, since it was a little, you didn't make a strong point one way or the other. Do you think that Booth was still following the directives of the Confederacy when he killed Lincoln, or was he off leash at this time and was just targeting Lincoln in his own way, following in the footsteps of what he had originally been part of?
Well, I don't know, and the reason I don't know is that, of course, this is not only before the era of the iPhone and the internet and instant communication, it's before the era of the telephone.
Yeah,
I mean, it's who is he talking to? And at this point, the Confederate, the
they're in
Confederacy is
disarray.
falling apart.
Yeah.
You have people are now getting out of Dodge, getting to Canada, trying to get to England, and all of that stuff. So that's hard to tell. I don't know the answer to that at
Okay.
all.
Yeah.
But I mean, there is evidence that he talks, at the Surratt House, talking about how guerrilla war could go on. I
Mhm.
mean, he cert he certainly believed, and as did Davis too, that until he was sat down and said, "No, you're going to surrender," but we can keep fighting. I mean, they are determined to
Yeah.
win. They're determined to win their independence, and they're going to fight as long as they can.
Yeah, in whatever ways they can too. Even it turned dirty, as you said. They were working on these weapons that were just
Sure.
unheard of before.
Right.
My one other kind of little detailed question
No,
is
that's
that
not all
that I
good.
had was there is a in my mind there is a noticeable lack of any mention of Dr. Samuel Mudd in the book. And
Yeah.
for the post-assassination stuff, that makes sense. As you only devote, as you
Right.
said, after Lincoln has been shot, you talk about the funeral, but you only give pretty much one paragraph summing up Booth tried to escape, made it
Yeah.
Virginia, was
Yeah.
shot and killed.
Yeah.
And that's, because that's not it's not what you need for this book. You don't need
Well,
to
and also
detail the whole thing.
Manhunt is out there. I mean, for anybody
Exactly.
who wants to read it.
So
So,
I understand it's like we don't need to include Dr.
right.
Mudd because all that, but Mudd does play a role, especially when it comes to this abduction plot. Because you recount that, John Surratt was introduced to John Wilkes Booth a few days
Right.
before Christmas, but you don't actually say it was Dr. Mudd who made that introduction. And so I was just wondering if there was a reason you omitted Dr. Mudd from the narrative or just
Probably just for clarity and
got
for
it.
clarity for um, the reader in Boise, Idaho, who
Yeah,
he kind of knows that the North won the Civil War and knows that Lincoln was assassinated, but doesn't know a lot of that and just not wanting to throw
another name.
lots of names that
Yeah,
didn't really so I have a rule in writing books in that um, you have your main narrative and you can go one step away from the main narrative if the material is really really good and
hmm,
interesting and exciting, but you can't go two steps away,
I see.
nor can you go just one step away if it's kind of complex, it doesn't really add to the story or can get people off the other side. So it was probably just for a simple reason like that. But also, it was just, I felt the need to really have a book with drive in it.
Yeah,
And I mean, that's why I punted, Reconstruction ideas and all that. Well, the fights with the radical Republicans, I just got rid of all that.
right. And that makes sense. I was just curious because I think part of the idea about the Confederacy being involved is the intriguing trip. And you do mention Booth going up to Montreal.
Right.
And that is to me that's the biggest like unknown thing where maybe he was and you had people who testified at the trial about
Yeah.
seeing Booth with Confederate leaders. Some of
Right.
them were later proved to be perjurers, so it adds it all
Yeah.
makes it
Yeah.
murky. But one of the things that came out of that trip to Montreal was letters of introduction to people in
Yeah.
Southern Maryland who
Yeah.
helped it. And one of them, and it's confusing though too, is because one account says that a letter he got was to Dr. Mudd, which
Yeah.
implies Dr. Mudd's own involvement in this Confederate underground. So that's why I was trying to see if you're going to include that, but I understand, like you said,
No,
it's
but
maybe two
and it's
steps
also,
too far.
mud is, as you well know, I mean, mud has been this lightning rod in the
Yes.
in the world of the Lincoln assassination and stuff like that. And I just decided that could be somebody else could go with it.
Yeah.
I have to tell you one thing that's been interesting to me, even though I have, been reading about the Civil War for my entire life practically, at my talks, and I've spoken in St. Louis and Tulsa, in Washington, D.C., and New York, and Baltimore, and Boston at this point.
You've been
I'm
busy.
I'm getting, and I've got tons more between now
Wow.
and the end of the year, but um, I've now get questions on any and all aspects of the Civil War. At one, I was asked, can you describe for us the development of ordnance in the North during the Civil War? And of course, that's outside of any thing that I have. So a lot of times I don't know. I've been asked a lot whether I thought Mary Surratt was part of the conspiracy or not, and I just haven't. I just didn't super drill down in that because that wasn't vital to what I
Right.
was trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's clear that you put, I mean, and I love so your book it surprised me at first because of course I'm so used to footnotes in the
Right,
sense of here's the little number at the end of the
right,
line and you go to the back and this is exactly where I got it. And you have done you have lots and lots of notes, but it's
right.
for each chapter. And so at first I was like, I don't know if I like this, but then I realized how much because I am a creature of habit where when I'm reading a book with footnotes, I will keep one finger where I'm reading
Right.
and one in the back so I can go back and forth. But your form forced me to read pretty much the entire chapter, and then that way I got the whole picture. I wasn't taking these stops, and
Right.
then I would look at the notes, and I actually found I did like that, even though it was a little bit different. But that is a great
Well,
way, I think, of
well,
writing for
that
the
you know,
general
the first
public.
book I wrote was again on the Tulsa Race Massacre, and that was done with LSU Press when I was in my 20s, and the book's still been in print, incidentally, since 1982. But that had footnotes, and it was very important to have footnotes because that was the first comprehensive history of this event that nobody knew
Yeah,
about.
you were laying the foundation. Yeah.
And so I wanted to do that, but with my subsequent publishers, they were more happy with the end note deal. But what I do is I cite things
In order.
chronologically,
Yeah.
so you can pretty much figure out. I mean, I give scholars and other people who really want to enthusiasts who really want to drill down. I'll let them know where I'm getting this stuff.
Yes.
They can see it, but for the general public who's not super interested, I do use the notes to explain things that don't make it in the text,
Yeah.
and things like that. And I've done that in the past, but it's a different way of doing it. But I've learned to adjust.
And I think it works very well for a general public who would get distracted by the tiny little numbers, at the end
Right.
of a sentence. So I actually think it works really well in here. I have one more question for you.
Sure.
Let's go to the big picture. You put a lot of time, a lot of research, and a lot of writing into this book. As the author, what big takeaways do you hope readers have when they finish reading Midnight on the Potomac?
Well, I think again, and some of this is going to be repetitive, but um, on the historical side, I would say I wanted to reinforce how close we came to losing our country in the sense that we were going to become at least two countries and maybe more. I think that's very important. I also think that the portrait that I'm giving of Booth, regardless of the degree to which he was acting under the orders or suggestion of the Confederacy or not, it shows that we just have a wrong version of him. And I mean, he was an absolute superstar, and I think that should cause some questions. I've certainly recast Sherman's March, which has,
Yes.
been long disconsidered. All this just destruction, destruction, destruction. That was certainly a part of it, but it's important to point out that Sherman told his soldiers, don't destroy the homes of yeoman farmers, don't steal from them. They're likely to be unionists, things like that. But it's really a march of self-liberation by African Americans. And so I'm proud of those things and putting them out there. But this goes again to the nature of where we are in our country right now. I know the listeners are going to come from lots of different perspectives, but the reality is that many of our traditions and our liberties are under assault.
Yeah.
And we're in a big mess right now. And what I want to remind readers is of the glory of our past. I want to remind readers of the fact that we've had so many people who have sacrificed everything to give us this great country and to try to, lift some spirits here. We're in a fight and it's going to be a tough fight, but we have a lot of people that are behind us in our past. And I think I want us to be able to draw inspiration from them as well.
And I will say you've definitely done that. And the book not only points to, great leaders like Lincoln, but also the power in the individual people collectively. Like I said, those chapters about, the African Americans who are joining Sherman's march to, hopefully for a better life, and the idea of how the Emancipation Proclamation brought forth really the regeneration of the Union Army by allowing African Americans to
Yeah,
fight, and how the country saved itself through the power of the people, not just, the
yeah,
great leaders, but with
absolutely.
us. And that comes across crystal clear. Well, Scott, I'm so grateful for you for sitting down with me today.
Dave,
For
I'm
anyone,
now my blood pressure is now going down.
this
I've
isn't a
dodged
gotcha
most
type
of
of
the
thing.
big bullets and stuff like that. So,
Yeah, I mean,
but let
well,
me just say this for
yeah,
everyone. Look, what you all do, all of you listeners and followers and readers of Dave's stuff at the LincolnConspirators.com, I think this is absolutely wonderful. The amount of expertise you all have, your dedication to finding materials. This is absolutely, it's the best Civil War site, period. question in my mind of that whatsoever. And I love what you all are doing. And I'm honored just to dip my little toe in the edge of the pond here, but just keep up the great work. I think it's terrific.
Well, thank you, Scott, and thank you for now becoming part of that family.
Well, good.
Whether you like it or not, you're stuck with us now. We're a clingy bunch. To everyone listening, I highly recommend Midnight on Potomac by Scott Ellsworth. It's a concise and engaging exploration of the last year of the Civil War and a wonderful accounting of the evidence, kind of leading to the idea that the Confederacy was involved and may have been the masterminds behind Lincoln's assassination. And so I highly recommend you pick it up. It reads amazingly. You'll read it in like a day if you're like me. I only stopped halfway through because I wanted to investigate one of your footnotes, and so that distracted me for a couple days. And then after that, I was right back into it, and it's so well written and really provides somewhat of an antidote, like you said, to our current times to make us be able to see we can survive this. We survived this. We can survive the times that we are in
Right.
right now and the differences that we have. So Scott, I want to thank you so much for talking with me today. And I know the book's going to be a success. I mean, you've had bestsellers. I hope this one is on the New York Times list pretty soon. It's just so well written. And so everyone watching, thank you so much for watching this and pick up Midnight on the Potomac wherever you get your books. And until next time, I'm Dave Taylor from LincolnConspirators.com and signing off.